So Vardhan, welcome to India.
Thank
Welcome
you.
to Stellaris.
Thank you.
As you know that the search to hire you was the single longest search we have had so far in our 8 years of existence.
There's a lot of pressure.
But we are delighted that you're on board and thank you for moving back to India with your family. I thought it'll be good for other folks outside of Stellaris also to get to know you. But as we get into that motion, would love, I think, for people to know why you decided to move from an engineering career to a venture career and why India.
So, firstly, thank you for the welcome, and thank you to you and the rest of the team. I think, and the ecosystem. I think, like, firstly, you know, as you know, over the last few years, I've had this, across like my past few stints, I worked at startups. Even though I started my career in big tech, I really, really enjoyed those short, few short stints. And then, as we were transitioning back, something that I always wanted to do was like work in the startup ecosystem or like join a startup. I don't know whether it's like the FOMO of missing out on like not having to work on like on a Swiggy or a Zomato or a Flipkart. I don't know what it was, but I always wanted to work in like the startup ecosystem in India. And I think as I was exploring opportunities, the opportunity with Stellaris came up, and I thought it would be a very interesting opportunity to work at a broad level in the startup ecosystem. And like it would also be like a really interesting opportunity for me to contribute the skill sets that I bring around like AI, machine learning, engineering leadership, the US India corridor. So I thought like it would be a good opportunity to contribute to all of that stuff. And the more that I think about it, I think like the entire SaaS ecosystem itself is a startup that is being built out of India. So I thought like I am actually coming to a startup.
What have the early impressions been? What has the experience been so far?
Oh man, I am like a kid in a candy shop in some sense. Uh, you know, I have been like extremely privileged to, get to meet, the portfolio companies, the founders, the people who are building, whether they're engineers, engineering leaders, or people who want to become entrepreneurs or who are on their entrepreneurial journey early and late, and also folks in the ecosystem. And I think like I've been like very amazed by the passion, the creativity, and the hunger and everything that is being done out here. Like one thing, we've also been talking about this in the past, that like I've been like listening to podcasts on how to become like an investor, as I'm doing this transition. And there is this thing of like, how do you build a no muscle, right? Like right now, when I go into meetings, like, I have like that solutioning mode, I have like that engineering mode, that, okay, if something is not working, how do I make it happen? So I bring in that optimism that, how do we make it work? So I'm hopeful that thing continues, and I can like contribute back, like whatever I have done so far, in whatever way possible.
Fantastic. So Vardhan, let's dive in. You have grown through in your career through the engineering ranks, right? And you have been an AI ML leader on the engineering side in your last few stints,
Yeah.
right? Now, as a layperson, of course, we also read a lot on what all is happening in AI, and of course, we're investing behind those themes today as well.
Yeah.
From an engineering perspective, though,
Yeah.
what has changed in the role or the definition of what's an ML engineer or an AI engineer today?
Yeah, that's a very, very overloaded question, and I think we can spend 30 minutes on that. So I think like first I'll describe like what is a machine learning engineer, right? Like and what it was like, before the entire, GPT era came along, right? Like I mean, I think the reason why ML engineers were so few was because it required you to have like a interdisciplinary skill across, software engineering, math, along with like data engineering. Like if you think about like what goes into building a machine learning model, like you start off with data. Like there's this famous quote by Andrew Ng that 90% of machine learning is basically data engineering, right? Like, and that's what I also faced, right? Like I mean, you have to spend a lot of time like first collecting the data that you have to train your models on.
Yeah.
And sometimes those data sets don't exist, so you have to figure out like where do you get that data, pipe that data into your system, pipe it into the offline system and the online system so that you can do inference. So you end up building the entire data engineering pipeline, right? Like you do that, and then comes the modeling part, which everybody thinks is the sexy part, but which is like the 10% of the part, right? And that is all math, right? At the end of the day, all you're doing is, there are all these algorithms, whether you use the abstraction of them or you go like dive deep into it and like, write it yourself using math. At the end of the day, they're all like math, right? And then once you've done your optimization or whatever you're doing, then comes the difficult part, which people don't talk about enough, is like productionizing them. You have to make it useful, right? Like you've done all the cool stuff, like now you have to serve it to real people and show real impact. And that is a completely different beast in terms of like software engineering. It has to be like low latency, that data does not have to drift. All those different kind of problems exist. So that's an entire field of like ML ops or DevOps and like software engineering in general. So it's a combination of all these three things that makes an ML engineer. There's like this funny thing that when I was at Lyft and we had a group of 20-30 ML engineers, and we used to sit in a room and we would try to calibrate. We used to try to do performance rating, and we used to find out that everybody's doing a very different job from one another, right? Like ML in general is like a very broad spectrum across multiple dimensions, and different people are in different places. So that's basically what an ML engineer was, or I'm hopefully continues to.
Yeah, I mean, which then begs the question, if you look at the last 2 years, it seems that many problems that were very hard to solve suddenly are appearing a lot more solvable. Does that, and that's primarily because, we are seeing everything from GPT 3.5, where it began, I guess, in November 2022, to the number of different announcements we have seen. All these things, has it changed the role of an ML engineer or an AI engineer, or even the definition of one?
I mean, the way I would like to think of is like, I think there is a new category that has been created, which everybody calls like an AI engineer in some sense. So, Alok, the analogy that I like to draw out is like, in my first job at Bloomberg, we were writing a lot of C++ code. And, there've been like days and weeks where I've spent trying to figure out like, where are the memory issues, where have I left, one pointer like not closed and is leading to like the entire system crashing. That's a PTSD story for another day. But like, as time went on, there were like abstractions that came across, that there were managed pointers and auto pointers, and then like not just within the C++ ecosystem, but also like the languages became like more and more abstracted. JavaScript came along, Python came along, and then like functional languages came along. I think we are seeing a very similar impact on AI right now in some sense. I don't like, you still need people who are working at like the very low level, at the kernel level, you still need those people to optimize your operating systems and things like that. But then like, with this new abstraction that has been created, right, like it's opening the world for a lot more people to come in. Like there's a mainstreamization of AI in some sense, similar to what JavaScript did to the engineering world. Like a lot more people could come in, write like front-end code, experiment with that and things like that. So a very similar thing is happening where your foundational models are like good enough that you have a whole new set of people coming in who are like AI engineers who are leveraging that in a lot of creative and interesting ways to build applications and solve problems that people would take like 10x more time to solve. Right? Like, I mean, something as simple as like, like building a cat and a dog classifier, right? Like, when we started ML, we would first have to find like 4,000 images of cats and dogs, like send it to Mechanical Turk or like some service for someone to like hand label them, then like build a classifier and then like, fine tune. So all of that stuff is like a lot more easier, and people are doing those things in like, 2 or 3 hours instead of like 2 or 3 months.
But does that mean, therefore, see, all those, like you picked on classification, right? For ages, we have had that as one of the AI problems that people solve. So a lot of the AI algorithms that existed in the pre-GPT era, is it fair to say that classical AI is dead, therefore, and there is now only the GPT era or the LLMs that matter, or is there a relevance of those toolkits today as well?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think like, the industry itself is like trying to figure out or come to an equilibrium right now, to be very honest, right? Like, I mean, I think we are still trying to figure out like how much can we push the LLMs to solve the problems that were solved by like, very bespoke, classification models in some sense, right? Like, I mean, but if you think about like, let's say Netflix, right? Like, I mean, I think they have built this proprietary recommendation system that like shows you the best movies that you should watch, right? Like, I mean, I think those things are still like pretty far away from what like, the transformers can solve. But I think what transformers are also doing is like they're kind of inspiring those underlying algorithms to rethink, the base algorithm, like to use transformers. Like, so for example, I have a friend who is working on like a time series problem, and like now he's thinking that, okay, how do I use this transformer architecture to do forecasting and things like that, right? Like things that were not thought of before. But I don't think classical ML is like quite dead yet.
Understood. So there is a class of problem that may still be relevant, but again, maybe a different form of the same question.
Yeah.
I think over the last 2.5 years, we are so enamored only with LLMs
Yeah.
that, of course, on one hand, we are dismissive of what existed before it, which, as you said, is not necessarily dead.
Yeah.
But do you think there is an AI hype cycle going on there for today? And by the way, that's a question our investors ask us.
Yeah.
And we discuss that in the community all the time as well.
Yeah. I would like to believe and say that we are not in a hype cycle, right? Like, I mean, that's like the binary answer, but like, I mean, of course, as you know, like everything lies somewhere in the middle. Like in my past, when I joined Lyft, we were going through another hype cycle of self-driving cars. When I joined them back in like 2018, we thought that we are at like L3, L4, and like in the next 3-4 years we'll solve the self-driving problem, the self-driving car problem, and everything will be autonomous. But here we are.
I'm still assuming we will, by the way.
I hope so, right? Like, I mean, and even right now we are in a very it's still mainstream only in like few cities. It's still to be tested out in like the rest of the world, and we're still like pretty far off. So having gone through one hype cycle, there is a part of me which is extremely cautious, right? But at the same time, I mean, I think in my past 15 years, I've never seen so much excitement or such a leap the technology has taken in some sense that makes me feel that I don't think we're in a hype cycle in some sense.
I am honestly scared, but that's a topic for another day. But if you then peel the onion, fine, it's not a hype cycle. It's a revolutionary technology in many ways, right? We never imagined what can be done with it. Would love to peel the onion on what do you find exciting, and I mean, it's still evolving. But what are the things that you are surprised with, and what is it that you find exciting?
So I'll talk about the surprised and then the exciting part.
Yeah.
I think on the surprise part, like I think like part of it is probably like my own hubris.
Yeah.
Right. Like I have been like very surprised and pleasantly surprised the impact of the LLMs have had on coding as a software engineer. Right. Like, I mean, I think, and the hubris part is like, I always used to think that, the stuff that I am doing or what my team is doing, like, is complex enough or is cool enough that, and that's also like the scary part, right? Like, I mean, you might think that you are insulated from this thing because you're doing like a complex thing, but, the foundational models are getting good enough that, we say this, that they're going to take away all the jobs. And I'm seeing that in my profession in some sense. I have been like very surprised.
By the way, your profession is different now. VC profession, which hopefully is not getting taken away.
That is fair.
By AI.
That's fair. So I think like I have been like very surprised. Like, I mean, I think if you look at like Cursor, with Claude, like, and there've been like a lot of tools that have come around that have like made the job of a coder a lot more convenient, right? Like, I mean, I think now we are seeing a lot more leaner teams have like very similar impacts that they had with like much larger teams, right? Like, I mean, of course there's a lot more focus after the post ZERP era, but at the same time, right, like, I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine and who's a back-end engineer, but now they're not hiring a front-end engineer because like now with Claude and with the rest of the tools,
Combi, if I may say so.
So I mean, like, yes, we have a lot of a bunch of our investments in this space as well. We are big believers in this space. So I was talking to a friend who's a back-end engineer, right? Like, and now they're not hiring a mobile engineer or front-end engineers because like he's trying to build out an MVP,
right?
And now with the help of like the current AI tools, he can get to a product which is like 90-95% quite out there, right? And like even if there are bugs and things like that, he can like leverage the LLMs to solve all of that stuff. So I think like that's the era that we are kind of getting into,
right?
So I've been like very pleasantly surprised by the impact of LLMs. I think what I'm really excited about the small language model ecosystem. I know like we focus a lot on like the large language models, and of course they've been like super transformational. Like the way I think about it is that right now you don't have to write the code to sort a list because somebody has written an API to do that, right? And then like there's this different point of like when you have to try to solve a problem, like there's not just one ML model. Like for example, when we were at Lyft, like to predict the price or to show the upfront price, there were like a lot of different ML models that had to
Right.
come in, right? So I feel like similarly, as we solve human problems, there'll be a lot of like LLM calls, and like they'll be extremely precise to the role for which they have been trained. And for that to work, they'll have to be small. They'll have to have like inference that you can do on the CPU, right? And that's why we're seeing like a lot of investments or a lot of exciting work happening around inference optimization, around like distillation of like transferring knowledge from large language models to small language models to make them precise for their certain roles, and things like that.
Actually, Vardhan, just a follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
There can be two kinds of small language models,
Yeah.
as I'm sort of hearing you. One is there is a popular belief that one LLM is not going to solve for every vertical or function. So one could imagine that for the legal domain, for I don't know, I'm just thinking about marketing domain, for others, there'll be different models and these will be SLMs relevant to those domains. That's a domain specificity of the model.
Yeah.
The other is to say that when you're solving a large problem,
Yeah.
that large problem involves 10 different steps. So like in a search,
Yeah.
one step may be ranking,
Yeah.
right? So that's more a functional cut to it, is to say that, look, you will have SLMs for these different steps, even
Yeah.
though it's the same domain that we are talking of. Where were you going with small language models?
I think I was going with like the latter part.
Understand.
I think like for the former part also, like I don't know if quite like we'll have SLMs, but we'll probably, I'm coining a new term over here,
Yeah.
MLMs, like medium language models in some sense. Because if you're like a legal AI,
Yeah,
right, like
yeah.
I mean you still need to fine tune
Yeah.
your data sets, or like you need to fine tune the LLMs to work for that domain, and it's like not generic enough. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Switching tracks a little bit, Vardhan, I mean, as you're aware, I have only worked in the enterprise space for the last 32 years.
Yeah.
But you have had the privilege of working both on the enterprise side or the B2B side as well as the consumer side,
Yeah.
applied AI to it. As you think about application of AI to these sort of two different worlds,
Yeah.
what do you find sort of dissimilar across the two? And actually, it'll be also useful just to know what kinds of stuff you have done in this, so
Yeah.
that sets a context for others.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, like just to set context, like, 6 years I worked on consumer products, like, Lyft was like a big part of it. And then another startup in the middle. And then like, 8 years I worked at enterprise. I used to work at Bloomberg, which I feel is like the OG SaaS company, if you think about it. And then like ClickUp for a year. I think in terms of like, what is different, I feel that like AI or machine learning in some sense, like in consumer companies, becomes like in some sort of a first class citizen, right? Like I mean, I think if I think about Lyft, right, like when I joined them 6 years back or 7 years back, they were working on pricing, using they were using ML, but and even right now I believe like they're still optimizing the pricing, right? Like I mean, I think like your machine learning in consumer at some sense becomes your first class citizen because it is driving the alpha,
Right.
And it has like a direct top line bottom line impact. And at the same time, like your AI ML becomes like extremely deep. It becomes like it's not just at surface level. You have to like continuously think about like how you're innovating, how you're iterating. Your solutions become like more and more complex. Like the first version of figuring out the surge price is like a lot more different than like what it is right now, probably, right? And I think like on the enterprise, I think it's a little bit other way around, which I learned the hard way, in some sense. Is like I think at the end of the day, the customer has bought the enterprise product for a certain thing, right? Like whether it's for the EHR or like the CRM or like something as simple as figuring out how do you give spiffs to your sales team, right? And I think like we are in the era where we are figuring out like this new transformational technology, how can it flip the enterprise, right? Like I mean, should we change the entire user experience? Would like an AI native product like change these things? So I think like we are in that space of figuring it out. And if you see historically, right, like I mean, AI has been more, it was always like the Googles and the Microsofts, and like the Netflixes and the Amazons, they were like the pioneers of ML, because like for them, if they did not innovate over there, it was like a loss of their alpha in some sense. And I think like now it's becoming a little bit more mainstream, right? Like, I mean, on trying to figure out like how do you improve, the user experience, or like, build products that wow the users and solves their problem on the enterprise side of things.
Do you also find, therefore, Vardhan, that a lot of companies we see,
Yeah.
we find that what I find using is like AI features.
Yeah.
I will summarize.
Yeah.
I will help you. It's almost like the next word prediction, etc., in your writing, etc.
Yeah.
Right? They seem incremental, so to say.
Yeah.
Right? In your opinion, is there an opportunity to reimagine lots of things even in the enterprise world with AI?
For sure. For sure. I think like, I think we are very, very early in the technology right now. Like, I mean, I think like, just when we thought GPT-4 had like, kind of plateaued and we were not seeing anything, like we were hit by DeepSeek, like, and the reasoning models, and now everybody is, bringing out like, what's in their pocket in terms of like reasoning models. So I think, as these foundational models, like get better, I think like there is definitely a lot of opportunity to innovate. I think like even in terms of, whether you think of it as like feature or building a co-pilot or building an agent, right? Like, I mean, I think everybody's still on a journey of trying to discover, right? Like that what exactly, and everybody's on the same page, or is at par, in my opinion, where they're trying to figure out like, what is it like that's going to crack the user, or what is it that's going to solve the problem for user that is much better than the incumbent. So I think like, I do feel that it will, but we're probably, all in a similar place in terms of, on that journey.
So, Vardhan, I mean, while we talked about the old AI and sort of the new AI,
Yeah.
one of the things that comes up as a challenge for many of the existing companies is that they were born in the pre-GPT era.
Yeah.
Right? They build their products, their stacks, etc. In that era.
Yeah.
And now a new technology comes, new players come who are actually, in some sense, if I may call them GenAI-native, right?
Yeah.
They were being born. In your opinion,
Yeah.
is it a disadvantage to be actually born in the earlier era and now trying to catch up?
Yeah.
And what would you do if you were a CTO, CPO of one of these companies?
Yeah. So firstly, I would love to be a CTO right now, and I would hate to be a CPO right now.
Okay.
And I'll explain why.
Uh-huh.
So firstly, like I think on the disadvantage side of things, so I think like for quite some time I felt that yes, like they are probably at a disadvantage because they like move a lot more slower. But I think like one thing that I'm kind of realizing is that, they still can play on their distribution, right? Like one thing, that all we are figuring out in the investor community is that, what is the GTM wedge, like, and all of those kind of things, right? So I think the incumbents do have the advantage of distribution, and this is probably true, like, earlier as well. Has always been true, but I feel like it's a little bit more relevant right now because, now the product differentiation, like, is not quite there as much because like the tech is like heavily democratized at some point. So distribution is playing like a much bigger role than what it did earlier in some sense. And I think like the other thing that I've also noticed is, which was true at ClickUp as well, like I think even the incumbents right now are operating with a sense of,
paranoia.
Maybe. Yeah. Like, I mean, or an existential threat.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, I think when I was at ClickUp, I mean, I don't think like they were threatened by a competitor.
Right.
But we operated with a sense of urgency or a sense of threat that if we do not rethink the product right now, right, like if we do not rethink that how do we improve the productivity of people with this new technology, like, there's an existential threat to the business, right? Like, I mean, nobody knew what exactly that threat was, but that was the sense of threat. And I think like, there's also like a sense of opportunity for the incumbents in some sense right now where, like they have this massive distribution and, the opportunity to rethink like how can they revamp the product that is like a little bit more AI native, right? Like has massive revenue opportunities for them as well at some level.
Then I want to come back to your earlier comment.
Yeah.
Why would you want to be a CTO and a CPO therefore then?
Yeah, I think like the short answer is that, like you get to build cool things right now with the new technologies. And so I think like on the CPO side of things, right? Like, I mean, I think as we talk to our portfolio companies and like these are things that I personally faced as well, right? Like there's this question right now that, like how do you prioritize between this new thing that is completely unproven or like these new features that I build out that I don't know if they quite fit into the story right now, but somehow I have to make them fit. uh, and everybody else is doing, versus this 6 month or the year's worth of roadmap that I already have that I know is validated from customers, right? So there is that push and pull right now where everybody is figuring out that how do you do that, whether like no matter how small or a big company you are, and I think I think like the thing that I'm kind of seeing working right now is that like a lot of companies are forming tiger teams that are only focused on like A-fying, if that is a word, the product, while the rest of the team continues to churn on like the roadmap. That's something that I've seen that is kind of working out. I think on the CTO side, like there are also challenges, by the way, right? Like, I mean, I think, yes, you get to build cool shit like the, new age stuff right now. But at the same time, there is a challenge, right? Like, I mean, you don't know who to hire. Do you upskill or reskill the people that you have within your organization versus like, do you hire somebody outside? And like, as I explained to you, ML engineers are like extremely sought after and, like extremely expensive as well, right? Like, so how do you do that trade-off? And I think like it's not just about the people, it's also about like choosing the technology. Like it's a build versus buy as well, right? Like, so when I was at ClickUp, like and we had a license with a certain LLM provider, but as we were working with them, like the second LLM provider released their models, and it turned out to be like much better than than the ones that we were using. So now I had like this conundrum that, okay, like now should I switch or should I stay with them? I don't know if they're going to come out with something better, or is this the end of life of like where the foundational models can get to. And this is just one small example, right? Like, I mean, I think as you're building RAG applications, which vector DB to use, right? Like, I mean, how do you figure out like the trade-offs? All of this like is super new technology. So there's like a lot of decision making that needs to be made, and a lot of these things, at sometimes are also irreversible decisions, right? And then also like there's also the question of build versus buy, right? Like, I mean, I think like now like now you have like folks in your team, you have machine learning engineers in your team, and you need to build out like this AI application, but at the same time like there is this vendor which is again a very blue chip team that is selling for the 1/10 of the cost, and if you were to build it, it would take you like 6 months and two engineers. How do you trade that off? So I think there are a lot of like interesting problems that CTOs and CPOs are facing right now, like in this like new onslaught of
Actually, on
LLMs.
that last point, any framework in your mind on the build versus buy? When would you buy versus when would you build?
Yeah, no, for sure. I can also like go back to some examples that I had in my previous life. So I think like the framework that I personally used was like, firstly, I think it's a great time to buy. Like if something is not core to your business, right? Like, so in my previous company, like called ShiftSmart, we were a marketplace for gig economy workers, right? And we were building out like a voice bot based onboarding platform. So like if a new worker would come in, they would have questions about like the shift that they needed to do. So that was a very clear buy decision, right? Like we were getting an off-the-shelf solution, working really well using state-of-the-art LLMs, and we were paying by the outcome, by the calls that were calls per minute that we were making. And when you were making the decision, right? Like, I mean, if I had to build that out, it would take me like 6 months, like, and an engineer. So that's like around, I don't know, $200,000 of like costs just to build it out. And we were getting an off the shelf solution. And it was like not a super core thing. It was like a important add-on, but at the same time, it was like not the core to the business. But at the same time, right? Like, I mean, if, like as we were doing this, one of the things that we had to do was, the worker who was going to a shift, sometimes they had to like take photos of like what the inventory was, right? So that's somewhere where we built ourselves, because it was very important for us to give like the most accurate feedback loop, right? And then we had to do a lot of customizations, right? Like for example, they would take the photo of a cooler of like a Pepsi or like a Coke, or like a beer cooler, and then we had to figure out the right images, like how much stock there is and things like that. So there we chose to like build ourselves, because we knew that it was not just an off-the-shelf solution, that it's like a one and done kind of a thing, that we'll have small iterations. Like right now we are doing coolers, tomorrow we'll do something else. So it was important to build that technology or like that know-how within the organization.
Understand. You did say that on the CTO side, one of the challenges that ML engineers are hard to hire. They are a lot in demand. and lot is being demanded of the CTOs to
Yeah.
actually build. You're right. I mean, frankly, every Series A company that I know, even in our portfolio or somebody else's portfolio, as they go for Series B, the first question is, "What is your AI story today?"
Yeah.
Right. So everybody is being forced towards it. When you come to this talent on
Yeah.
the AI side, and you have seen that talent in the US also, and now beginning to see that talent in India as well, as you have begun to talk to the portfolio companies.
Yeah.
Where are we on the evolution curve for the AI talent in India today?
Yeah, I think, I think, like, to be honest, like, I think, like, we're pretty much at par, or like,
Yeah.
we are like the talent that I have met so far, like, I have been like very amazed by them. Like, they're at par with like the creativity, the know-how, and I think like a lot of things have changed in India over the last few years. I feel that has led to that, in my opinion. Like, I think the biggest impact that I think we've had is like now we have, like, what does good look like? What does a gold
Yeah.
standard look like? We've had companies like a Swiggy, or like a Zomato, or like a Flipkart, that has scale that is like comparable to the US based companies, right? Like, if not more.
Yeah.
Right. And now people are solving the similar optimization or like the ML problems over there. So like
Right.
now people know what are the pain points. So I think, like, even within the country, like, our boundaries are getting pushed
Yeah.
in some sense. The second thing I feel is like, the knowledge has become like very democratized. Like, earlier, when I went to the US, like, as a kid, I was very surprised by how siloed the knowledge was, like, in the universities, in some sense, right? Like, I mean, I think what I got from like the professors sitting in one class, it was very difficult to find anywhere outside.
Yeah.
Right. But now I think the knowledge is like fairly democratized. You can go to a
Right.
YouTube, look at like MIT series and things like that. You can, there are like a lot of courses on Coursera and things like that. So there are a lot of ways where you can upskill to the state of the art, and we are seeing a lot of that in the ecosystem, at least in my experience.
Got it. Got it. Vardhan, one last question.
Yeah.
You have built your career ground up in the AI ML hierarchy
Yeah.
as an engineer. Put yourself in the shoes of a young engineer in India today,
Yeah.
software engineer, who either wants to be an ML engineer or is already an ML engineer and wants to, in a way, add value to the company that they are part of. What advice would you give to them?
Yeah. So I feel like I have been very fortunate to find the right mentors in my life. I don't know, like, if I found them or they found me, or like I'm just like happy that happened. I think like that, and that has been like the single biggest transformative thing for me, right? Like, I mean, I think one thing I would highly recommend people is like find mentors, find people who know what good looks like, find people who will push you, right? Like, find people who will create those opportunities for you. That's been the biggest, like, uplifting thing for me. I think the second thing, I started my career as a backend engineer, and then I moved into machine learning, right? Like, so the thing that I tried to do was like do backend engineering work for machine learning people, right? And then that got me into the ecosystem of like where I could like learn, through those 10,000 hours kind of a thing, that like, what does a machine learning engineer mean, right? Like, what are the things that they do, right? Like, what is the lingo that they talk about, what, how do they think about all of these things? So I think like these are two things that I would like recommend.
Perfect. Vardhan, I thought that during the interview process and the ref checks, I got to know everything that was to be known about you, but I've actually learned a lot even through the conversation today. Looking forward to your contributions to the startup ecosystem in India and the years ahead. Thank you.
No, likewise, thank you so much.